So earlier this year, I decided I wanted to move studios to a place where I was going to have just a little bit more room to, stretch out my legs, but also where I could operate just a bit more smoothly as a guitar player. Now, that's a really exciting premise, right? How could it not be? But the one thing was that I knew it was going to take just a little bit of time. I knew it was going to be a pretty long moving process. There was going to be a pretty extended waiting period while this place was built, where I was essentially going to have to take all of my gear out of the old apartment, put it into storage while I lived with another family. All the while I'm doing this, I'm consistently just thinking to myself this one single nagging thought that keeps circulating around my brain. I kept just thinking to myself, okay, you're going to have all of your gear in a storage unit almost 30 minutes away that you won't have immediate access to. You're still going to want to practice. You're still going to want to jam with other people and just see what you can do creatively. It would probably be a smart idea if instead of just taking like one virtual amp with a headphone jack, if you took just one single amp in case you needed to mic something up or you just wanted to play with people in person. So I go over to the storage unit to drop everything off, and I'm rummaging through the absolute mess that I've made, and yes, I do have proof of that, and I happen upon the smallest amp that I've ever owned. This little 5-watt amp that I had gotten a couple months earlier called my Fender 57 Tweed Champ, which realistically, looking back in hindsight, actually feels like a little bit of a strange choice. But Michael, it's an amp like any other amp, but actually in my specific situation, in a lot of ways, I think it's not. You see, I'm a worship guitar player, and when I'm not on the job, like a neo-soul and blues wannabe. So a large amount of the time, unless I'm going for a very specific sound, one of the things that I've started to like more recently is really high headroom when it comes to amps and clean tones, which are the tones that I tend to lean in more toward. Amps that can get higher volumes without necessarily breaking up too much for these like really articulate clean tones. It's the type of thing where you slap an unnecessary amount of reverb on that, you put just a hint of delay, and you feel really good about yourself. But I'll tell you what, this amp right here is not that at all. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's actually the exact opposite of that amp that I just described. Now, that's not to say I didn't like it or it's bad. That's to say that this amp is so different. Now, I've had smaller digital or practice amps before, but none of them had quite as small a speaker as this one. And more importantly to what I'm getting at with this whole conversation, none of those amps were actually Tweed. Well, Mike, what about the Blues Junior that you were just making a big fuss about like a couple months ago? Trust me, I promise I'll address that in a minute. Now, if you're not familiar at all with Tweed amps, let me give you the really simple rundown like Jim Halpert. Tweed amps are a line of amps that were originally produced by Fender in 1948. Amps like our friend the Fender Blues Junior may have a Tweed covering, but they're not necessarily true Tweed amps like something like a 57 Champ. When you start talking about the circuit and the actual sound that's coming out of the speaker, Tweed amps are generally known for having more mid-range as well as really low headroom. And once you get to a speaker this small, coming in at about 8 inches, that means it's probably going to start breaking up at way lower volumes than you're used to with different styles of amps. Now, I tend to associate that sound with a lot of early rock and roll guys like Keith Richards, a sound that I really love, but wouldn't necessarily be the go-to for like the sake of versatility if you were just looking for one go-to amp for a million different genres. Now, like I said, I had owned this amp for a couple months, and I had gotten to know it just through making videos about the Rolling Stones and trying to really tone match. But this was the period where I really started to get to know the amp on more than just a first impression or trying to tone match it basis. And I got to really figure out how to interact with a lower headroom amp and try and get some of these clean tones that weren't necessarily like the things I was used to, but were newer to me. Tones that were completely different from a lot of the go-to cleans that happen to be living in my head on a consistent basis. I thought for a moment that the Fender Champ was going to turn me into the Tweed man that I never thought I'd be. But then I remember really quickly, there's more than one Fender Champ. Not all of them are Tweed. So this right here is the 68 Vibro Champ Reverb, and as you could probably tell, it's in the Champ family, but it's not necessarily Tweed, because I wanted to see how different they were. I wanted to really explore this world of smaller wattage Fender amps in the non-Tweed section, where I know it's going to break up more easily than my Princeton or something like that, but it still has a few different reputational points. So I think it's time that we mic this thing up and actually see what these people are talking about. So I'm going to try and essentially make this as easy as possible. one mic on the speaker. I'm going to be using the Royer to see what's up, and I'm going to be having it a bit farther away from the speaker cab than I usually do, like not right next to it. My main goal is to see how this champ, while still being in the same general family as the 57 champ, but a lot less minimalistic with its digital reverb and its EQ section, will feel and sound differently. So I think it's time we put it to the test. So the coolest thing about starting with this amp as opposed to the original 57 Tweed was that I felt like I was in two completely different starting mindsets. With the original 57 Tweed, I just plugged into input one. I was like, let's crank this thing. Let's see what the low headroom breakup is all about. But with this guy right here, we had more options. We had more EQ settings. We had a reverb. We had a tremolo. I didn't even know how this thing was inherently supposed to sound. But I thought that a good starting point to see what it was supposed to do, like with most amps that I use, obviously the clean tone. And that's where things got really interesting, because I could have just done the usual thing, put this thing to 5 and been like, okay, here's my clean tone. I have a Strat, I guess that's what it's supposed to sound like. But with amps, one of the things that I'm figuring out, especially with some of these low wattage, low headroom amps, much like in life, there's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's more than one way to get one single tone. So let me show you what I'm talking about, especially when it comes to these cleans. Like I said, you can start with your volume at 5. And that's a cool clean, or you can try and hack the system a little bit, and you can turn your volume way up. Say to almost 9. Then you can back off the volume on your guitar, and you can get this cool broken up thing that you can control at any moment. And you can sort of filter in as much grid as you want or don't want. Now, the other really cool thing I found about some of these amps is that those aren't even the only two ways to do this. One of the things that I often overlooked with the original 57 champ is that there wasn't just one input, there was actually two. These aren't necessarily two different channels, they're two different inputs, but these two different inputs both affect the gain. The second one is a little bit of a lower gain input. I found that I've really been able to utilize that, especially knowing just how easily that first input breaks up. If I want to stay like crystal clear on those cleans, sometimes I'll just set the volume at like 6 or 7 on the second input and really go to work. And that'll really keep me in that lower output range if I was trying to limit the amount of volume in this room, which I'm not because we're in a new space now. Really cool thing about all of these gain staging habits is that it doesn't just apply to these amps in terms of clean tones, it also applies to how they actually take pedals. Now with the 57 Tweed champ, I never really felt the need to use pedals to use an overdrive or distortion, because a lot of times I was heavily going for that Keith Richards style rock and roll thing, where the point is to really just let the amp break up on its own. But with this, I started using a more transparent overdrive, and there were lots of different individual things I did to try and achieve a more broken up tone. I could have done it the same way that I did with the first amp, where I just turned it all the way up to 10 on the volume knob, and then put it on the first input. That was very broken up, but once I started turning on the actual transparent overdrive pedal, the thing that I noticed when I got the tones that I really liked was I allowed both the amp and the pedal to equally do some of the heavy lifting. So I wasn't just taking a clean tone and completely distorting it. I was pushing the amp volume probably back to like 7 or 8, then pushing the overdrive pedal to about 12 o'clock on the drive setting, and that's where I started to find something really special. So once I got into the weeds of really trying to shape those clean tones, I got actually into the EQ section, and that's when I really started to figure out how much individually you need to take a look at your amp, even if they're in the same family. Because this thing right here, as opposed to the original 57 champ, has an EQ section. But not like it's the same amp, but they just add an EQ section. The more I started to actually play through some of these clean tones and really realize what this sounded like, it was pretty basic. And I realized that the smart thing to do was to adjust for that bassiness, which means I was turning up the treble on this amp more than I do on most amps, and I usually keep them at around 5. Now, the next thing that really got me, as opposed to the original 57 Tweed champ, was the inclusion of the actual reverb. Now, utilizing the reverb on any unit is going to be completely different amp to amp. But one of the things that I noticed when I took this out and started reading the manual for the first time was that we had a hall reverb. Now, when it comes to in-amp reverbs, what you're going to be used to and what I'm used to most of the time is having a spring. So having a hall that's actually pretty ambient. Not saying it's the longest of decay times in the world, like something akin to a Strymon Big Sky, but comparatively to a lot of the spring reverbs that I'm used to in an amp I use a lot, say like my Supro Amulet, it really is a big difference, and you can't just always crank something all the way up to 10 and go to work on a lot of your blues licks, because that would sound bad. So at the end of the day, what did we learn, and why does any of this matter? Well, let me tell you. I think throughout my years of guitar playing, I have a tendency to think of amps in very simple terms. Fenders are for cleans, Voxes are for slightly broken up, and Marshall and Soldano, those are for like the high gain tones that we don't even touch. But once you start to really get into the nuances of it, thinking about stuff like Headroom or about the different circuits or about different sizes, it's kind of a whole new ballgame. And even though I'm in some very infant beginner stages of learning about some of these concepts, it's completely changing the way that I view different amps and the way that I view which amps are the best for my specific tones, because now I can think to myself, oh wait, it's more than just Fender versus Vox. Now it's Fender versus Fender, and it's the 5-watt amp may have less headroom, but sometimes I like those clean tones as opposed to something like a Fender Twin, which has a lot of high headrooms. And it's even starting to make me realize why I like a lot of the amps that I like. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters what I think. What matters is what you think. So please let me know. Do you like the Fender champs? Do you tend to lean towards some of the bigger, more higher headroom amps? What do you think about the whole Silverface versus Tweed debate in general? Please let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you friends so much for watching this video. I've been waiting for what I would talk about first in this new studio now that it's like completely built. And also it was just a real pleasure to be able to actually crank this amp and see what it can do in my bedroom without ever having to worry about any of my neighbors since finally getting out of the apartment. So it was really cool. Also, if you want to know anything more about the 68 Vibro Champ Reverb, I got it from the homies at Sweetwater. The links are in the description. Make sure to check it out. One of the best ways to support the channel, if that's something you want to do, or if you're just curious about any of the other gear that I use in this video, guitars, mics, make sure to check out those links. Also, thank you so much to all of my patrons. There's some exclusive extra content on there if you want to join the community. Like and subscribe if you had a good time, and most importantly, most important of all, have a fantastic night.